When Pharaoh Ramses III ruled Egypt, his word was law, divine, unquestionable, and everlasting. His power stretched from the temples of Thebes to the farthest lands of the desert. In his own view, he was not only a king, but the living image of a god. Yet behind this golden mask of authority, whispers began to spread along the Nile. The enemies of Egypt, those who dared to oppose the pharaoh, had been defeated in battles. Their soldiers were dead, their banners were burned, and their kingdoms were lost under the sand. But for Ramses, the war was not finished. He believed that rebellion had to be destroyed not only with the sword, but also erased from memory. The men who opposed him were executed. But their wives faced something even worse. What Ramses III did to them became known as one of the darkest actions in Egypt's ancient history. If you like these dark stories, like the video, subscribe and write a comment below about where you are watching from. Because this is not a legend or a rumor, it is written word for word in the Turin Judicial Papyrus, the same document that revealed the notorious Harem conspiracy against the pharaoh. And hidden among the fragile lines of this ancient text lies another story, the story of revenge, of punishment turned into a spectacle. Ramses III did not only destroy his enemies, he made them an example. His justice showed no mercy. It was a theater, a message carved into human suffering, created to remind Egypt that even the wives of traitors could not avoid the anger of the divine king. So let us go back to the heart of Thebes, to the palace hall, where the pharaohs judged not only the guilty, but also those connected to them by blood, by loyalty, or by love. Egypt, which Ramses III inherited, was only a shadow of its past greatness. The pharaohs of the new kingdom once ruled with wealth beyond imagination. But by the time of Ramses, decades of wars, hunger, and corruption had weakened the state. The great temples still glittered with gold. But outside their walls, ordinary Egyptians starved. There was little grain left. Soldiers who had once fought for glory now fought for food. Enemies appeared on every border. Libyan tribes attacked from the west. The Sea Peoples, fierce raiders from the Mediterranean, struck the Egyptian coasts like waves of destruction. Even inside the palace walls, loyalty grew fragile. Ministers whispered, servants listened, and royal women watched, waiting for any sign of weakness. Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of Egypt's golden age, found himself surrounded by betrayal. He ruled through fear, not through trust. Every threat, whether real or imagined, was punished without mercy. The pharaoh tightened control, creating a vast network of spies across the provinces, Memphis, and the royal court. His orders reached every corner of the land, even into the private lives of his enemies. When rival kingdoms dared to rise up, Egypt crushed them. But Ramses wanted more than victory, he wanted humiliation. He wanted their names to vanish, their bloodlines wiped away, their legacy destroyed like an offering consumed by the fire of a temple. In his eyes, the women who remained were still part of that same legacy. The wives of his defeated enemies, queens, priestesses, and noblewomen, were not spared. In his judgment, guilt was inherited. Punishment became shared among all. They were brought into the fiefs not as captives of war but as warnings, living symbols of what happens to those who challenge the living God of Egypt. Soon they understood that mercy did not exist in the court of the pharaoh. The sun was setting over the Nile when the captives arrived. The river turned red under the light of twilight, as if it carried the blood of the fallen. Boats floated toward the city of Thebes, this time not filled with goods or treasures, but with women. Some had once been queens in their own lands, others priestesses of foreign gods, and others noblewomen from cities that no longer existed. Now they stood in silence, their wrists bound with linen cords, their eyes fixed on the rising gates of the pharaoh's city. The streets were lined with soldiers and citizens. People came to see, whispering that these were the wives of Egypt's enemies. Women who had once worn gold now walked barefoot in the dust. To the crowd, it was a show of power. To the pharaoh, it was a performance. Every step they took was meant to prove that the divine ruler of Egypt could bring even the proudest foreign queens to their knees. Inside the palace, preparations had begun. The hall of judgment was illuminated with oil lamps that flickered on carved walls, showing gods weighing the hearts of men. But this was not a divine judgment. There were no scales, no mercy. The pharaoh had already decided their fate. Each prisoner was recorded by the scribes. Their names were written, their origins noted, their families marked as enemies of Egypt. Their identities were preserved only to be erased later. For the women, waiting was worse than chains. No one told them why they were still alive or what punishment awaited. That night, the palace corridors echoed with the sounds of celebration. Priests sang hymns of victory, and soldiers feasted. But behind the torches, in the shadows of the courtyards, women knelt together, whispering prayers to gods who would never respond. In one of the temple chambers, a scribe quietly recorded that among the captives were wives of rebel princes, brought before His Majesty for judgment. Nothing more was written, only that they were taken to the house of women inside the royal complex. It sounded harmless, but those who served the pharaoh knew its true meaning. People said it was a sanctuary where royal wives and concubines lived in splendor. But behind its carved doors, the truth was very different. For the captives of Ramses III, it was not a house of beauty, it was a house of silence. The rooms were large but empty, stripped of gold, filled only with the echo of steps and fear. Guards stood along the corridors, their faces wrapped in linen, their orders strict. Not a single word was to leave this place. Each window was closed with a lattice of stone, and little light entered. It was a beautiful cage, meant to remind the prisoners that even surrounded by luxury, they had no power. The women were separated by rank. Those of noble birth were given rooms for rest, while the others were placed in common halls, sleeping on mats. They were fed poorly, bread, dates, and water from the Nile. Their jewelry and fine silk were taken away, replaced with plain linen robes marked with the seal of the pharaoh. It was humiliation, carried out step by step, deliberately and completely. Their former lives were erased piece by piece until they became nothing more than reflections of the pharaoh's triumph. For the palace scribes, their existence turned into mere records, a list of foreign names next to the word taken. Yet among themselves, the women held tightly to fragments of hope. Some whispered about ransom, others prayed that perhaps the pharaoh would one day release them. But they did not understand who Ramses III truly was. This was the same pharaoh who had survived an attempt on his life inside his own harem, the same ruler who believed that rebellion was born in the hearts of women, that wives could give birth to treachery as easily as to life itself. For him, punishing the wives of his enemies was not cruelty, it was strategy. A lesson written in bloodlines, ensuring that no child of rebellion would ever rise again. Days passed and turned into weeks. The captives were forced to appear before the priests, who recited the oath of loyalty. They were ordered to renounce their former gods and names. Some obeyed, while others stood in silence, their eyes steady, their lips unmoving, and those who refused were never seen again. No one knew where they had been taken, but each morning the guards carried out bundles of linen, wrapped too tightly to be clothing. When Ramses III learned that some captives still defied him, he did not rage, he smiled. For him, punishment was not chaos. It was ceremony. And in Egypt, every ceremony was sacred. Orders spread through the land, reaching every temple and tribe, announcing a new ritual. It was not written among the festivals of victory, yet everyone knew its meaning. The priests called it the purification of the foreign. For the people, it was justice made visible, vengeance disguised as holiness. The chosen day came beneath the burning sun. Crowds gathered in the temple courtyard, where the scent of incense rose like smoke from distant battlefields. Drums thundered, trumpets sounded, and the captives were led barefoot, dressed in pale linen. Traces of their former kingdoms could still be seen faintly in their tattoos and remaining ornaments. They were forced to stand before the statues of the gods, while the singers loudly proclaimed the names of their fallen husbands. Traitors, rebels, enemies of Egypt. For every name spoken, there was a curse or hymn meant to erase their memory. But the pharaoh desired more than words. He stepped forward, wearing the blue crown of war, holding the crook and the flail crossed over his chest. With a voice that filled the courtyard, he declared, "Let those who divided the hearts of my enemies share their fate." Let all of Egypt see that no bond, no woman, and no love will ever hide rebellion." The priests obeyed. What followed was not a swift execution, but a slow, deliberate humiliation, a ritual designed to break the spirit before the body. When it ended, they were not freed but sent to the edge of the desert, where the labor camps of the pharaoh stood. There, the wives of kings became slaves to stone. They carried limestone blocks for temples they would never enter. They ground grain for the soldiers who mocked their prayers. Some survived for a week, others only a few days. Their suffering was not hidden from the public. Messengers were sent to the borderlands with stories of what had been done. The message was clear: Egypt forgives nothing. The priests recorded the ritual as a triumph of divine justice. But within the quiet corners of the palace, servants whispered that the pharaoh's revenge had gone too far, that even the gods might turn their eyes from him. Months passed. The cries of the punished wives vanished into the desert winds. But inside the palace walls, something darker began to stir. Where fear rules too long, loyalty dies in silence. Servants whispered that the gods had turned away from Ramses. Offerings spoiled during the night. Oil lamps flickered without wind. Priests dreamed of falcons falling from the sky, the same broken falcon that had been the mark placed upon the captives. The great halls of Medinet Habu still shone with gold, yet rot began to grow beneath the glitter. The pharaoh who once ruled the richest empire on earth now lived surrounded by silence and suspicion. Even his concubines walked with eyes lowered. Songs once sung in his honor turned into whispers of curses. The women's chambers were heavy with incense and fear. The wives of courtiers and soldiers who had seen the captive's fate now feared for their own. They knew what disobedience brought, and they began to ask themselves, if he could do this to the wives of kings, what could he do to us? It was there, amid whispers and secrets, that the first traces of conspiracy were born. A woman named Tia, one of Ramses' secondary wives, began gathering allies. She had watched him punish the innocent and saw how his hunger for control devoured his mind. And she knew, if she did nothing, her own son would never inherit the throne. Tia's plan was simple yet fatal. She would strike at the very heart of divine power. She began to reach out to those who had lost everything because of the pharaoh's anger. Soldiers who were humiliated, priests who were disgraced, and officials who had been ignored in promotions. She offered them hope and the promise of revenge. But in Egypt, conspiracies never stayed hidden for long. Dream interpreters began to speak of visions. Snakes crawling in the queen's bed. The chief scribe discovered strange marks burned into papyrus. Names were crossed out and replaced by others. The guards felt a sense of fear they could not explain. When the news of the conspiracy finally reached the pharaoh, he laughed. He had built his empire upon fear, believing that fear would protect him forever. But fear is a blade that cuts both ways. What Ramses could not see was that his own court no longer believed that he was divine. They obeyed him from habit, not from faith. And once that faith disappeared, even the greatest ruler in the world was only a man, waiting for punishment. The night it happened was quiet, too quiet. The wind that usually whispered through the temple courtyards had stopped. Even the sacred cats walking through the palace halls seemed to sense what was about to come. In his private chamber, Ramses III was preparing to sleep. He believed the danger had passed. Weeks earlier, he had ordered arrests, interrogations, and executions, convinced that he had destroyed the conspiracy before it began. But he did not know that the real traitors were still inside his palace, waiting. The allies of Tia acted carefully. They bribed the guards, replaced the servants, and hid messages inside offerings and bottles of perfume. They knew the hour when he drank his wine, the moment when the doors were locked, and even which guards would fall asleep first. That night, Ramses lay on his bed of carved cedar, under linen sheets that smelled of lotus oil. He was older now, heavier and slower, yet still sure of his divine nature. But to the conspirators who watched from the shadows, he no longer looked like a god, only like an old and weary man. The attack came quickly. A curved bronze blade flashed in the torchlight, the same kind used in sacrifices. Ramses tried to rise, but the hands that once ruled an empire could not fight betrayal. The knife cut deep into his throat, silencing the voice that had once commanded nations. Servants said they heard nothing. Others swore they saw priests carrying something wrapped in linen through the corridors before dawn. By morning, the pharaoh was gone. His death was hidden behind ritual words. The court announced that the great lord had peacefully joined the gods. But the truth did not stay buried. The Turin judicial papyrus, found centuries later, revealed all the details of the conspiracy. The names of Tia's allies, the trials that followed, and the executions that erased a whole generation of courtiers. Some were burned alive, others were mutilated and branded. Even Tia herself disappeared from the records. Her fate was not written, perhaps deliberately. For Egypt, this was more than the death of a ruler, it was the death of divine order. The pharaoh was not killed by invaders, but by his own family. The god-king bled like any mortal man. And in that blood, Egypt saw its own reflection, the price of power built on fear and cruelty. When the mummy of Ramses III was discovered in the 19th century, scientists found a deep cut across his throat. The great pharaoh who had enslaved and punished the wives of his enemies died the same way, silent, bound, and helpless. For centuries after his death, the story of Ramses III remained buried under sand and silence. The temples still carry his name, and the inscriptions still praise his victories over the sea peoples and the restoration of Egypt's power. But the truth written in blood, slept under the tombs. Even his successors refused to mention it. To admit that the living god had been murdered by his own family was unthinkable. It would destroy the illusion of divine power that held Egypt together. And so, the story was rewritten. The murder was erased, and the conspirators were forgotten. But the stone remembers what people choose to forget. And in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Ramses III still told a story that could not be silenced. When archaeologists opened his sarcophagus in the 19th century, they expected to find another perfectly preserved pharaoh. Instead, they discovered horror. A thick linen band wrapped tightly around his neck, denser, heavier, and thicker than usual. When modern scans were made centuries later, the truth finally appeared. A deep, precise cut across the throat, undeniable proof of murder. Ramses had not died peacefully. He had been stabbed. And nearby, in another chamber, they found another wrapped body, the corpse of a young man. His face was twisted in terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Historians believe it was Pentuer, the son of Tia, the prince who took part in the plot to seize his father's throne. His body was smeared with resin and oil, yet his tomb bore no name. He was denied honor, denied eternity. The Egyptians called him the Screaming Man. The reign of Ramses III, once seen as the final golden age of Egypt, did not end in triumph, but in betrayal. The empire was divided, its riches drained, its gods doubted. And though later pharaohs wore the crowns of their ancestors, none ever restored the same fear and reverence that had surrounded the throne before its fall. What began with a ruler punishing the wives of his enemies ended with a king murdered by his own. It was a perfect circle of cruelty, a mirror reflecting Egypt's darkest truth, that no power, no god, no wall of gold can protect a man from the cost of his own tyranny. Today, the story of Ramses III is more than ancient history. It stands as a reminder of how civilizations rise to greatness and collapse under the same human flaws that power creates: greed, envy, fear, and betrayal from those who once swore loyalty. So when you look at the statue of the pharaoh, at the proud, defiant face carved in stone, remember this. Behind those calm eyes and that flawless smile once beat the heart of a man who believed himself untouchable.